Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It's your man Akil again. You know, I like to explore the whole libertarian concept and its intersections with other ideas, as well as the experiences of people in the movement like myself. One thing in particular I like to do is give as much evidence as possible to support the reality that libertarianism is not just for rich, straight, white Christian men. I should also add, I guess, cisgender to that and a few other choice positions of privilege in society, shouldn't I? You've already heard a lot from me, a Black libertarian. Now I'd like you guys to hear a thing or two from a libertarian feminist. You heard me right, libertarian feminist. No, there is no contradiction between the two, and that is what we're going to learn about this evening. I'd like you to meet my friend, Kat Murti. Kat, say hi to the folks.
Hi, thanks for having me on today.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me. Why don't we just start with you telling us a bit about yourself, Kat, as well as how you came to identify as both a libertarian and a feminist.
Sure, I'd love to. You know, I get this question a lot, and it's always a little bit hard for me to answer because there's no set point where I woke up one morning and I was like, hey, I'm going to be a libertarian now, or hey, I'm going to be a feminist. I think it's sort of ideas that I've been playing around with for a long time, as well as sort of like this inborn part of me that's always, loved freedom. I've identified as a libertarian since I was 15, only because that was the age at which I first learned what libertarianism was. I was on the internet, on message boards, talking to people about ideas, about policy ideas that I had, things like that. I was a really weird teenager. And someone was like, hey, I think you're a libertarian. Take this test. And they legitimately sent me a test for the Nolan chart. And I was a libertarian. So I decided I was going to start reading what that was. And my whole life, up until that point, I'd been searching around and I couldn't find anybody who seemed to agree with me on my views on politics. You know, I actually had this shirt that I used to wear that I made for myself that had the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant on it. And it said, when two rights make a wrong, because I sort of associated the right with authoritarianism. And I was like, look, both of these parties are fundamentally anti-freedom. That was my awakening moment where I was like, hey, all of these ideas I've had about the individual owns themselves, that's the fundamental building block of society as the individual, all of this is libertarianism. There's a name for it. I'm a libertarian. Feminism kind of similarly, obviously there's a lot more discourse about feminism. So I probably identified as a feminist since I was a little girl. I can't remember a moment in my life where I thought to myself, I'm a feminist. But as far back as I can remember, like Lisa Simpson at age 8 saying that she was a feminist, I was like that. Fundamentally, it comes from the exact same thing. People come up to me and they say, like, how can you be a libertarian feminist? These are two fundamentally different concepts. And they're really not. Both libertarianism and feminism at their core are about the idea that individuals are different. Individuals are not part of a collective, and individuals should have the right to live their life as they wish and to make their own choices unhindered by any sort of state or strong limiting forces on what they can do based upon who they were born as.
Absolutely. Let me just say very quickly, I too was a weird teenager, and I guess I'm still a weird adult, so I totally relate to where you're coming.
That's right now, so.
There you go. Tell us a little bit about your organization, Feminists for Liberty. How did it start? How long has it been around, and how's it doing?
We're a fairly young organization. We recently started a little while back, I want to say March of 2016, and there's discussions between me, Elizabeth Nolan Brown, my co-founder, and a few other women, and some men as well, who identify as libertarian feminists. It really came from this tension we felt with the 2016 campaign cycle. We kept hearing this hackneyed argument that if you are a feminist, you have to vote for Hillary Clinton, which is, of course, completely antithetical to the ideas of feminism to say all women must think one way. Feminism is about choice. It's about embracing women's abilities to follow their own life path. It's not to say, hey, you have to view things this way. You can only have these views. So that was kind of bothering us. And then, of course, as I'm sure you know, there were several other issues that came up during the campaign cycle that really did highlight the fact that there is a big gap here. These are all ideas that we'd sort of been playing with for a while. The libertarian movement at large, it seemed as if in the past few years, all of a sudden, there's a lot more people who didn't fundamentally believe in gender equality, and who even would argue that feminism and the ideas of gender equality were antithetical to liberty, which we felt was just fundamentally untrue. In the same way, when you would see feminists represented by the media, it was almost exclusively this type of leftist feminism, socialist kind of policies, or the idea that government has to step in and do all of these things that we were very much opposed to. So it was sort of three different forces bringing this about. One was that we wanted to talk to other libertarians about libertarian feminism. We felt that this was a voice that was being erased, is something that is at the very core of libertarianism for all of us. We also wanted to get that message out in the media. First off, not all feminists are socialists. And secondly, that yes, of course, you can be a libertarian and also a feminist.
What are some of you guys' main activities?
We've just sort of been kind of doing a slow burn, getting started lately. We've been doing some speaking events. We've been doing a lot of commenting. Actually, right now, what we're trying to do is build up the discourse that's happening already in social media and other similar platforms, just kind of start thinking about that. And we're also kind of highlighting the work that other folks are doing in this area, whether it's some of the work that Elizabeth Nolan Brown is doing with Reason. She's got a lot of great libertarian feminist ideas. Some of the work that Chelsea Follett's been doing over at Cato, or Vanessa Calder-Brown, or all of these libertarian feminists who are working on this for different organizations. We're kind of pulling together all this information and trying to make it more of a resource to people. We've also been working with other organizations. I'm the DC chapter leader for the Ladies of Liberty Alliance. I'm also involved with the leadership committee for that. Lola had recently hosted a really awesome one-day conference on women and liberty. I don't like the idea of women's issues because I don't think any specific issue is only valid for women, in the same way that I don't think that women necessarily have a specific worldview that you can put in a box in that way, but certainly talking about these issues. And so that was something Feminists for Liberty really heavily promoted. So we're slowly getting bigger and bringing on more people in terms of the discussion and having people engage with us on these ideas and think about what it means to be a libertarian feminist in a modern context.
In your interactions with other movement libertarians, have you encountered any resistance? Of course, I already know what the answer to that question is, but for my viewers' benefit, what kind of pushback have you encountered, and what are some of the struggles and difficulties that you've encountered dealing with that resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the onus for starting Feminists for Liberty was the fact that there was a lot of pushback in the liberty movement against the idea of feminism. And that comes from a couple different angles. Unfortunately, there are people who don't believe that all sexes should be treated equally, who don't believe in things like women's rights, trans rights, those kinds of things. It's a very small percentage. Honestly, I tend to believe that these are people who really fall more in the alt-right camp rather than libertarianism, which is a whole nother discussion, right? Exactly. It's a whole nother discussion that I don't necessarily want to sidetrack into right now, but there are some of those people. There are also a lot of people who are turned off by the idea of feminism because they entirely hold it to be the same thing as this type of leftist feminism that they see commonly portrayed in the media. So then they'll say things like, oh, you support all of these state programs. Nope, no, we don't. We don't support these state programs. We're libertarians. We're libertarian feminists. We're not feminists who lean towards liberty. We are libertarians and we're also feminists. And so there is pushback from that angle as well. Some of the discourse of late has been specifically about, and this is a bit of a difficult topic to get into, but call-out culture. And I'm not a big fan of call-out culture overall, but I think that there are times when it can be valuable. For instance, when specific individuals who are the face of an organization in some capacity are also publicly promoting very sexist views, we feel that it is okay to we're not talking about doxing, we're talking about sharing the views that they've publicly shared on a wider platform to tell people like, hey, so when you support this person, these are the views that they're promoting. And there are some libertarians who feel that that's an attack on free speech, where I completely disagree. I think that free speech includes the right to criticize other people. I think that this is kind of a space where there's a lot of thought happening, really interesting new thought happening right now within the liberty movement as well on free speech, what that means. Because of course you don't want to be actively chilling free speech. However, there's also a question of, is using your free speech to criticize someone else's free speech when you're also very specifically not calling for any sort of state intervention, you don't say that certain types of speech should be illegal, is that an attack on free speech? And I tend to say, no, it's absolutely not. There are some folks who argue the opposite. They say that you can't criticize certain types of speech because that you're then chilling that speech. And there's a possibility of that. Maybe that's true. I tend to believe that it's healthy in society to be able to have these discussions, to talk it out. And I do think that there's a real fear out there because there is a push for criminalizing all types of speech. We're completely against that. We don't want to criminalize any speech. However, we don't feel that saying that there are certain people who do have very hateful views and sharing those hateful views and pointing out, hey, this is a hateful view that we don't want to associate ourselves with, is an attack on free speech. And I think that that's also been something that's been a topic of debate, particularly around, for instance, misogynistic comments that have been made by certain members of the liberty movement in a public setting, in a public forum where it was meant to be seen by specific people, that when those people criticized it, that was considered a big problem as well. So I think that those are kind of the different areas that we get attacked on. Honestly, I think the biggest problem, though, is what I said at the beginning. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a feminist. Yes, you can absolutely be a feminist and not be a socialist and not support government intervention. I mean, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe that the government should be involved in anything. I certainly don't think that the government needs to be involved in equalizing myself based upon my gender. And if anything, I think that we can argue that the government has been the number one cause of gender inequality through a lot of laws that they passed. A lot of people don't remember that it wasn't up until the 70s that a married woman could represent herself in court completely freely and easily, or could own her own property. And it wasn't until like 93, 94, I can't remember off the top of my head, that marital rape was illegal in this country. You could rape your wife or husband, I suppose, as often as you wanted, and it would be totally legal. I think that those are fundamental issues that are enforced by government. I don't think that we need government to fix these problems. I think we need to get government out of the way. I believe in Hayekian and cultural change. A lot of this is about just talking to people and highlighting, and most people are fundamentally good. They want a better world. And when you start talking about what it means to have a better, freer world for everybody in a way in which no one's really feeling attacked, I think that's a big part of it. When people feel attacked, they tend to go on defensive. And so finding a way to do that, I think, is the way forward. And that's sort of what we're trying to do.
When it comes to talking to people, how often do you guys talk to left-wing feminists? And have you been able to make any inroads with them, just in terms of cooperating with them in areas where you think you may have common ground with them?
I think that there's a few different questions there. How often do we talk with left-wing feminists? I think that that's probably something that I would say is more on an individual level. That's not something that I'm doing like specifically as Feminists for Liberty at this point. I try to look at discourse and I try to interact with people across the political spectrum, people with different views. In an individual capacity, I try to talk to people from the left to the right. And more specifically, I try to follow the discourse around that, whether that's reading blog posts or just honestly, a lot of it's on Twitter. I certainly interact with a lot of these folks on Twitter. And I think the thing is, when you're a libertarian, you can find things to agree with people across the political spectrum. So I think that's definitely reflected as well. One of the issues that Feminists for Liberty wants to tackle, we believe in all gender, anti-state, anti-carceral feminism, right? So we're not just interested in talking just about issues that affect women. We want to talk about issues that affect men, that affect non-binary, trans, genderqueer, etc., the whole gender spectrum. And on an issue-by-issue level, I think that we're able to find people who agree with us on basically everything, even if it's not necessarily one person who will agree with us on everything. I think that's just fundamentally something about being a libertarian more than anything else.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've always found appealing about libertarianism, which is that you tend to have at least some common ground with most everyone. Just about every sane person on the political spectrum will have at least some occasion to agree with you at least some of the time. That's definitely one of the perks of being a libertarian. For those of my viewers who may be interested in learning more about libertarian feminism, what would you recommend in terms of individuals whom they should really check out, say on social media or elsewhere, besides yourself, obviously? What names and maybe what blogs, websites, or other organizations, in addition to the ones you've already mentioned, would you recommend people check out?
Well, I think there's a lot of different great people, there's great organizations, there's a lot of good resources out there. Obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, please follow Feminists for Liberty on Twitter and Facebook. That's kind of the best way to know that what we're doing, and follow myself and my co-founder, Elizabeth Nolan Brown. There's also a lot of other great libertarian feminists out there talking a lot. I think Avens O'Brien does a great job of talking to people across the political spectrum about these ideas from a very libertarian standpoint. On the more left libertarianism side, we have people like Kathy Reisenwitz or Jackie Feist. On the more right libertarian side, you have people like Julie Borowski, who does not identify as a feminist, but does sometimes speak about some of these issues. I think that there's also a lot of great organizations out there you can learn from. I already mentioned Ladies of Liberty Alliance, of course. There's also the Association for Libertarian Feminists. Wonderful organization, was started by Toni Nathan, who's actually our country's very first female presidential candidate. She was run by the Libertarian Party in the early 70s, and then she went on to form the Association of Libertarian Feminists that's run by Sharon Presley. She's a very smart woman. I would certainly recommend looking at some of her work. Oh, wow. There's so many wonderful organizations and people here. I'm almost having trouble figuring out which ones to mention, but there's a lot of great content out there. I mean, if you're interested in the more economic side of thing, I would look at some of the work that Jamie Lemke's been doing or Sarah Squire have been doing. They've got a lot of really interesting research on capitalism and women, both in terms of how women fit into the labor market and also the history of capitalism and how capitalism has really helped build up women's rights. We always have this narrative that we hear about how women's rights are fundamentally anti-capitalist, and that's not at all the case. And in fact, the more capitalist and the more free market our society has been, generally speaking, the more rights women have had in our society. So they both do a lot of great research around that area. Vanessa Calder-Brown, this is not her main focus, but she's got some really interesting stuff on the wage gap, which is a real problem, but is not at all a problem in the way that people discuss. It's not that we have a wage gap because people are saying, hey, I don't want to pay women. There might be a couple people who are like that, but that's really not the problem. The problem is we have all these cultural conditions around that in which, for good or bad, but it's worth understanding, and then understanding how we might want to change that if it's something that we want to change, why women are making certain decisions that do tend to create this wage gap. And of course, the wage gap isn't just one way. For instance, if you have millennial women, younger millennial women like myself, who are in their mid-20s to mid-30s, unmarried, without children, educated, live in cities, make significantly higher than their male peers. So the wage gap actually does go both ways. I think that you have to look at these situations with nuance, and a lot of that is unfortunately lost. I work in digital marketing, I work in social media, I'm online all the time, and I love it. I think the internet's the great democratizer. People are able to get hold of all these ideas that were kind of kept behind gates before, and they're able to learn so much more. They're able to connect with people they never would have had a chance to meet previously. However, I think unfortunately there's also two dangerous tendencies. One, that because people are able to meet all these people who think similarly to them, they also tend to self-select themselves into smaller and smaller bubbles of thought. So I think that that's a concern. And secondly, issues tend to get boiled down to this very cut and dry, black and white, this is right, this is wrong. And I think very few issues actually fit in that kind of thing with no nuance. I think this sort of like fell into that as well. It's complicated. All of these issues are very complicated. That's why it's important that we have this ongoing open discourse about them.
That's right. The world is a complicated, messy place, and it's high time a lot of people recognize that across the whole political spectrum.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And God love it. I mean, I wouldn't want to live in a world without that mess either.
There you go. Same here. Thanks so much for joining me, Kat. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to having you back on my show as soon as possible, as well as hopefully joined by some of your fellow libertarian feminists who unfortunately weren't able to join us this evening. I look forward to many, many more fruitful conversations with you.
Same here. This was a great time. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.